All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. We're going to be looking at chapter 4 in the Violence Project, and I appreciate Stan's leadership the first couple of weeks. I watched last week's video or class, but I haven't watched the first week. I'll have to go back and catch that a little bit later. So come on in. I'm going to open with a word of prayer. Our lesson today. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to study this work, and for authors who have led this study and given us data and things to think about ourselves. We pray your Spirit to bless our conversation and watch over our thoughts as we share them today. That we would hear you in the words of one another and grow in a deeper appreciation for not only some of the pain in the world, but what we can do as your children to alleviate that. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So as I mentioned at the start, we're going to be looking at chapter 4 today, and to get a feel for the rhythm of what's gone on the first couple of weeks, and from today, I'll map out the rest of the chapters for you. And I think we've got, if I remember right, we have 6 weeks. So there's 4 weeks after this. We have to cover the remaining 5 chapters. So we'll have to double up again. As I recall, it's been a while. I read the book when it first came out, but the one of the chapters I kind of felt in the first read through, it's like, I can't see that we would spend as much time talking about that one. So it'd be an easy one to combine, but I'll let you know. Before we start looking at chapter 4, just any general impressions that anybody wants to share? We should just take a moment to see, kind of check in. How's it been for you in reading this book?
Well, I said it last week. I'm just enamored with this book. It's so enlightening and really gives us a stark look at mental illness and assumptions and these mass shooters and violence. It's just a whole different perspective than I'm getting from anything I'm reading or watching on TV or hearing about. I just like the work that went into the details here, and I think chapter 4 has been very illuminating about our assumptions about mental illness.
Yeah, we'll talk about that today. Definitely. Thanks.
Someone said at the start of this that they thought the subject was hopeless. And to me, the book gives me a lot of hope, I would say. That there are things that can be done. I don't know if they will be, but there's things that can be done to at least reduce the problem.
Yeah, I agree with Don. Not so much, not trying to jump ahead, but when you get into the discussion or the relationships and what that means and things that we can do, and then further on, I can in that chapter where some things that are happening around the country, it does give you the hope, I think, that ways to attack this problem.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, well, I don't necessarily feel about it. That's kind of me, because I think we've had plenty of opportunity to deal with gun laws, and that's addressed in the book later, and we don't do anything about gun laws. And I know relationships are important, but then I think about me and I go, well, what am I? I'm not sure that I think, well, how realistic where am I dealing? How often do I have a chance to do that? How many people do I not working anymore? Do I really see day in and day out to make a difference? So it's important, and there's to give you things to do, but I just still feel like I'm not sure. Am I gonna be that right person in the right place to make a difference? Because there's a small minority of us in crisis that end up doing these, I guess, these kind of gun-related violent acts. But as I'm processing and thinking, it's really also, this applies to just trauma and crisis, and that we're not mass shooters, but there's other things we're doing that are displaying because of our trauma and crisis and problems, that if we are in tune to each other, we can take care of other things we do in response to that. Drugs, alcohol, being mean to each other, road rage, all kinds of things. So, there you go, roundabout answer there. I gotta talk to sort of thing.
By the way, can you pass this around and see if anybody else needs the handout? Any other thoughts or impressions? Part of the reason I asked that question is because I think that this chapter and the story of Molly, which we'll be addressing here, we'll take a look at together, really captured me and my attention in the book, and I think gave me something that it at least was some, semblance of hopeful, and something that we can kind of latch onto. And I see plenty of opportunities for us as church, as the people of God, that we can maybe make some sort of a difference. So anyway, we'll kind of continue to kind of checking in as as we go along here. But so I pulled out a few quotes and thoughts, and we have time for other kinds of subjects that you might have brought from your reading as well. At the end of our time, I do want to show a TED Talk. Aaron Stark is mentioned in the book at the end of the chapter as somebody who was a would-be mass shooter that was brought out of a time of crisis. And I found his TED Talk. He doesn't mention anything about his friend's mom baking anything, but you get to hear from him and his words what his experience was and how a friendship made a difference for him. So hopefully we'll have time to kind of watch that process a little bit at the end. So I pulled out this quote: 80% of all mass shooters in our database were in a state of crisis in the minutes, hours, days, or weeks prior to committing their shootings. What's the correlation between crises and mass shootings? You're reading. What's the correlation between violent act like that and somebody in crisis?
Obviously, a strong correlation, 80% of the mass shootings in crisis.
Mhm.
So the crisis, like the trigger for the mass shooting, that kind of hits the button that gets pushed.
Yeah, then the analogy, of course, they use is the balloon, right?
And
Yeah. What was that?
just filling, it's like being a balloon, everything you put into it until it finally pops.
Yeah.
out of the air. Oh, no. Yeah.
If somebody hasn't already developed a pathway to a mental health counselor, the process of gaining counseling and from somebody that is built rapport with the person that's undergoing a mental health problem is certainly long compared to these minutes, days, hours, weeks. Just to get a appointment is certainly in the level of weeks. Particularly if you're looking for somebody who's able to deal with low income and or some sort of medical insurance. It's a slow process.
Yeah.
And it's not obvious how you go about it.
Well, and pairing the right counselor with the right person and the right problem can be tricky. It's not like every counselor is going to be able to deal with every person in crisis. Probably.
But I think one of the lessons in this chapter is that, somebody that's in crisis, the prescription then is not to say we need to get them to a counselor right in that moment, right? I mean, that there are things that can be that we can do to recognize that and help people, in that moment. It may well be that somebody needs, further kind of counseling. I mean, you know, our son Ari has anxiety. And, you know, when he has these moments, you know, he gets under, you know, a lot of stress. And, you know, he thankfully, you know, between whether, you know, it's family or, you know, teachers and, you know, people at school that know him. I mean, there are resources and, you know, he's learning some things himself on how to kind of bring that, reduce that anxiety. So it's not a matter of, you know, always that we need to send somebody to a mental health professional, you know, some sort. But even kind of in between, you know, somebody who's regularly seeing somebody, you know, is constantly dealing with that. There might be different events in somebody's life that send them toward a crisis. They're not so predictable. Have you ever experienced anything along the line? I mean, certainly not with the violent and maybe, but you know, maybe hopefully not without a violent outcome. When we say this, but experience that phenomenon, the balloon. You know, have you felt that in you?
You know, there was a book, wasn't there, maybe 20 years ago, maybe it was called Margin, Living in the Margins. It just kind of analyzed how close to the edge we are in this culture, economically, socially, and a whole series of kinds of things where we're just like 2 steps away. And I think that's kind of the context in which we live. So then when a single event that's kind of looms large, you know, all of a sudden it brings that to a head, like a festering thing. And I think we're all kind of susceptible in a pressure cooker kind of world. We're trying to make ends meet and so that. So,
Yeah.
And I guess the point of what I was saying is that if somebody is prone to getting into a crisis situation, if they have parents, if they have friends, if they have somebody else that's able to guide them into that challenge at the time to do that, it is well ahead of time. It's not just suddenly they reach that point, it's the breaking point. And part of what is involved, I think, is there's a social stigma about mental health counseling. That people are just not very willing to admit that they need some help. You know, I see it more from the parents' role. We've had 2 daughters that have needed, maybe not at that level, but at least some help getting through their teen years.
Well, there used to be a lot of work. They used to involuntarily commit you to a mental facility. I went to one in 1997, but I was in crisis. So, yeah, I don't know if they still do that, but
Well, there's certainly there's less of an infrastructure that way today than there was 25 years ago.
They still have like a involuntary hold that they'll put on you for a short amount of time.
72 hours.
Right, I wasn't sure if it was like 36, 48 or 72, it's some multiple, well.
Yeah, and it probably varies from place to place too.
I think so, like, at least in the state, I'm pretty sure it's 70, but that's usually if you were showing signs of suicidality, more often than not.
really disabled.
Hmm?
Really disabled was what my people said.
Gotcha. And usually there's some concern about you being a threat to yourself in
Yeah.
some way, right? So.
That or
more-
homicidal.
Or homicide.
So,
Oh, right, I didn't know what.
They do ask.
so what do they do for 72 hours?
They hold it. Like, usually, and that usually means like you've gone into like an ER or, and they just keep you there for an amount of time. Just to make sure that you're not actually going to hurt yourself or hurt somebody else. I'm not sure what happens outside of a hospital context, if it's sort of like they take you into custody for that amount of time, I'm not really sure the ins and outs of that, but after that, according to the law, after those 72 hours pass, you have to go.
Yeah, I think the timing you mentioned a month. What we ran into in California was on the order of 7 days or 3 days or something. You go into the hospital, if you're not willing to stay there on your own, you're out.
There's different kinds of commitment though. There's a voluntary commitment where you voluntarily go in, and that's where you can leave. But if you have a 72-hour hold placed on you, that's court ordered and you have to, I mean, they own, like somebody said, they own you. And there's different psychiatric hospitals, but they're very hard to get people into.
I'd like to move on to the next question. And we're on the topic of mental illness, and there's a quote on page 59 from Donald Trump: "Mental illness and hatred pulled the trigger, not the gun." So what I'd like to unpack from that statement, and the authors talk about it, we can take a look at it if you want to look again, page 59. But in what ways is this statement accurate? And in what ways is it unhelpful when it comes to understanding and addressing subject of mass shootings and how to end them? So how is it, what's accurate in that statement?
The person is the one that pulls the trigger.
The person that pulls the trigger?
That there's a difference between hatred and mental illness.
Okay, difference between hatred and mental illness.
I don't know, sort of clumping those two together.
It is maybe
Yeah.
lumping them together.
The authors discounted that statement as saying it just painted a broad brush stereotype of mental illness, which is not the point of looking at these mass shooters.
Keep going. What's the what would the point be, I guess?
The
Or
point
look at-
would be, and this was illuminating to me. Because, you know, you hear national figures say, well, you know, it's mental illness. Well, no, that's simplistic and stereotyping. That's not what this mass shooting phenomenon is really about. There's something deeper, there's a deeper core. And I know we're gonna get to the
Mhm.
chapter on hate and opportunity and
Yeah,
those things, but one thing I loved about chapter 4 is I remember the first time I read about psychopaths. It just was hard for me to wrap my head around somebody who is narcissistic and has no conscience. And how that is so different, because a psychopath is a sneaky killer. A psychopath is not a mass shooter. I mean, I just find this really educational, and I think most Americans never really encounter these kind of thoughts.
Yeah, you're really kind of getting at something that I wanted to explore, is that I think that in the subject of like mass shootings, it's easy to point in one direction or another, that it needs to be dealt with in, with gun laws or with, more mental health resources and so on. And it's not something that can be tackled with one particular, thing. And, the idea of, I'm not sure what really is accurate about in the statement anyway, I'm trying to be generous here, but I mean, that there is a correlation between some mental health, aspects and mass shooters. But there's also a variety of other kind of factors that lead into it. And you're jumping ahead to things like opportunity and so on. Because many people, I mean, part of the problem, I think, with this is the statement is that it does stigmatize mental illness. I mean, many of us have gone to counselors and sought help, for when we've had our own troubles. And there are many people that have schizophrenia or some of these more, I don't know what the adjective I'm looking for.
Anxiety.
Well, but more, what's the word I'm looking for? More
Psychotic.
psychotic disorders, yes. That never act out in, in such a way, and so on. But that's, whenever something like this happens, you turn on cable news, you're not gonna hear what's, what we're talking about in the book. It's, what are the things that we hear? What are the problems? I've heard some of it from what you guys talked about last week. It's mental health. It's guns, prevalence of
Trauma,
guns,
childhood trauma.
trauma,
Isolation.
isolation, video games,
Anger,
anger.
loss of hope, hopelessness.
So there's a lot of different elements, conspiracy theorists, maybe, people caught up. I mean, that, so,
When I said what is true, it's true, it's not a gun. That doesn't mean that I agree. I am not pro gun or anything like that, but it's not really the gun that did it. Yes, it does have the person has to have the access to it in order to be able to do this. It's not the item that's the problem. But that's the only positive thing I could agree with on the
That's
statement.
interesting. You made me think of, so what if you didn't have the opportunity to have a gun, but you had an opportunity to have another type of weapon? Like bombs or grenades or whatever. So we're talking about mass shooters and we're talking about guns, but yeah, cars, driving your car into a crowd. Timothy McVeigh
Oklahoma City
bombing,
bombing.
yeah. I mean, are they part of the whole picture here of the trauma and destruction?
well, Timothy McVeigh would not, because he was not a mass shooter, he was a bomber,
I
right?
know,
Right.
but that's what I'm
But-
saying. Are there
it's all of them.
parallels here with?
I would argue yes, that
I don't know.
they chose a different method. And I know we're talking about mass shooting because it seems to be
Right,
a little more prevalent than
but I think,
bombers, but
but I think there is some difference, and we have to go back and look at the data and everything to see. But do you recall from the reading whether or not there are any politically motivated mass shooters? That you think, I mean, there's maybe racially, right? The shooter in Buffalo just recently.
El Paso,
El Paso,
also El Paso.
what was the El Paso? Oh, yes, also El Paso, yes,
Mhm.
okay.
or they for the synagogue and.
Okay,
The New
yeah,
Zealand shooting.
but like McVeigh in the Oklahoma City was the anti-government, right? I don't know, anyway, there are maybe some distinctions.
I'm not saying that they're the same, but
Yeah.
but there's something in. I would argue that there's something in our society that does not support people finding that these actions, these violent actions are they don't have access to people to sort of calm them down and blunt this. So that's my point of it being, yes, I know we're talking about gun violence and mass shootings, but that's not the only thing that we can solve by implementing some of the items that we're talking about
Right.
in this book.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's.
Yeah,
Well, if you take this,
Yeah.
to me, if you take this down a notch, like with how you started this, so not mass shooting necessarily, but other things that trigger in people to do, whether it's violence or whatever it is. I get stuck on the fact that in my own experience, I've known people who seem to have had the support around them and still popped.
Hmm.
And then there are others who I thought, this child or person will never make it. And they did. What was the difference between those?
Hmm.
And of course, that takes us back to the shooters. What what's the difference between that shooter and that person who seemed to have the same experiences?
Hmm.
And yet didn't do a violent act. And I'm stuck on that.
I think it might just
Yeah.
be random luck. Blind luck meaning someone in their life cared. And I've been with a couple of people in crisis, what I would consider a serious crisis, and all you do is just stay there, be there, listen, encourage them, not deny them.
But the people I know have that support
Yeah,
and they didn't make it.
yeah, I know, well,
And it just breaks my
I
heart.
know, but all you can do is keep being there and try to get them help, and if they, some people are just, harder to heal, and I don't know the answer to, everybody gets out of it.
How come?
I don't know. I just know how people get out.
Yeah.
John?
We already restrict a lot of ways that you kill a number of people. We restrict dynamite, we restrict poisons. But the culture of the United States is such that guns are not restricted. Limited restrictions. And the tests that we do to give people permission to buy a gun are a joke. So I think focusing on gun violence is, it's what these researchers did. The causes that lead up to the violence, I think, are ones that could be broader in scope. I mean, we need to deal with those causes, whether it's because of shootings or because it's the right thing to do.
Well, there's, and that would have been from the first chapter, right? That's where I need to go back and watch from your discussion, but we're talking about something that's kind of uniquely an American situation too. And
I feel like I talk too much in this class, but I want to share this with you. I went to visit my sister in Baltimore, and she lives next door to a young couple with 2 little boys. And it was summer and it was hot. And my sister asked the neighboring mother, I'd like to buy your boys some water pistols. Would that be okay? And she said, no guns. We are not letting them have guns. So we went to the dollar store and we found some water shooters that weren't shaped like a gun. They were, push things, not trigger things. And I just found that interesting. It's like, wow, I wonder how many parents have that kind of thinking about how they want to raise their kids. I'm not raising you to point a gun at somebody, even if it's a water pistol.
It doesn't matter, they'll pick up sticks and go bang, bang. They do.
They probably
Just, you can't get around it.
I'm just curious, did she say that was okay?
Oh, yeah, she
Those
said
are
that was
okay.
okay, just not a pistol, not a gun shaped.
So a water cannon is good. Great.
do we want to talk more? You touched on this earlier about the difference between psychotic and psychopathic.
Oh, yeah, okay,
Yeah,
so,
give us a short.
Yeah,
so when you hear the term psychotic, these are very precise medical terms. Psychotic is referring to someone showing 2 of your major psychotic features, schizophrenia, hallucinations, and delusions. The idea behind a psychotic episode is the person has broken from reality and they're having a hard time telling reality apart from their delusional thoughts. Person who is psychopathic, that is usually a term applied to someone who has antisocial personality disorder. That's a person who does not have a moral compass and does not recognize other human beings as being valuable, and has a hard time with empathy, and that's one of the key features. They typically do not have a good internal model for the emotions or experiences of other human beings. They also tend to experience very impaired stress reactions when they are punished. And that's one of the reasons we think that psychopaths actually don't end up developing a moral compass during their adulthood development. There's some impairment in the hippocampal adrenal pituitary axis, or the HPA axis in the brain, where whenever we're punished as kids, we experience a stress reaction. It's unpleasant. We don't like being punished. And that actually helps us to learn to avoid doing the thing that resulted in us getting punished. When we've taken a look at the brains of people with antisocial personality disorder, that system is not working correctly. So when they're punished, they just don't feel anything. It doesn't stress them out, doesn't make them upset. There's no unpleasant emotional reaction, no connection between breaking a rule and being upset is formed. So in a lot of ways, as we've done more work on understanding people who are quote unquote psychopaths, we're finding, again, it's really an issue of whether or not they've internalized that moral compass and learned to empathize with the people. So they don't have a problem harming other human beings. Does that difference make sense? You know,
Yeah.
are there any details of that? Like, is there anything you can clarify?
So then is the psychotic thing fixed more with drugs and the other is they're not dealt with the
Okay.
same way?
With antisocial personality disorder, it's an insanely hard disorder to treat. You usually have to use pretty intensive cognitive behavioral therapy. There are absolutely no drug treatments that are going to manage the core symptoms of APD. With schizophrenic symptoms or psychotic symptoms, it depends on what causes it. Schizophrenia is just one of a large number of psychotic disorders, including, well, I mean, like you can even have some psychotic symptoms occasionally with certain forms of mania and even depression can sometimes have delusional thoughts and hallucinations connected with them. So it just really depends on the root cause will sort of influence our treatment. Most of the time with schizophrenia, yeah, we're going to use an antipsychotic. Usually like, I mean, they have class 1, class 2 antipsychotics now, and they all basically reduce dopamine activity in the brain. Because when you're dealing with hallucinations, delusions, and again, cognitive distortions, which are the core feature of schizophrenia, the brain itself, its wiring is not functioning correctly. It's a physical disorder, the same way that a cold or the flu is a physical disorder. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, as we're learning more about antisocial personality disorder, we're finding that we used to think it was just the way that you raise the kid that results in them developing these personality quirks, but that's not what it is at all. It actually appears to be a dysfunction in the brain as well. Like in any single mental disorder you look at, there's something going on physically in the brain that causes the
That's
symptoms.
good.
Yeah,
What about, how does narcissism kind of play into?
Different.
Antisocial?
Totally
Is that
different.
a brain thing? Or is that-
No, that's another personality disorder. That one is another one of those disorder processes that we're still researching a lot because it's hard to get narcissists to cooperate with researchers. So they are like,
What comes to mind?
but you have to be very careful. You cannot equate psychopathic disorder with a narcissistic person. They're not the same thing.
They're
Narcissists,
both paired a lot.
they are paired a lot because they both possess the very unique feature of increasing the chances of the person who has the disorder harming or severely injuring another human being. With narcissistic personality disorder, we're talking about extreme self-interest to the point where, again, empathy is impaired and the person does not value other human beings in the same way and is comfortable harming or injuring them in some way to benefit themselves. So they are literally the center of the universe for everything going on around them. And anything that does not immediately glorify them or benefit them is kind of thrown out, ignored, or actively attacked in some ways. So the person that you may be thinking of as a field, we have had many discussions about that particular person. And the consensus is narcissistic personality disorder, not psychopathic personality disorder. So does that help a little bit?
Yeah, that's good.
Any other, that's part of the reason I'm gonna say I haven't had the chance to read as much of it, but I'm here because I know you all gonna have psychology questions and I'm not a psychologist, so I'm happy to answer them.
How does making the distinction between the two, following the question, between psychotic and psychopathic, how is that helpful for us, you think, in terms of understanding mass shooters and mass violence?
Well, it really kind of helps flesh out the fact that whenever we talk about mental illness, the thing that I teach my students is that nuance matters. There are subtle differences, like the nuance of the difference between narcissism and psychoticism, for instance. I mean, they are different animals in a lot of ways that may have similar outcomes in terms of behavior, but the root causes are more complex. And you have to approach a narcissist very differently than you approach a person with APD. Very much so with a person who is psychotic. The problem with a person who is psychotic is they don't agree on reality the same way you and I do. And their delusional ideas may be impenetrable to a person that you're trying to kind of talk down or reassure in some way. So very often mental health care providers, when they're interacting with a person who is psychotic, you have to make a choice. Do I challenge the delusion and try to use a grounding technique to bring the person back to reality, which that can work sometimes, and sometimes it really doesn't, depending on how far into the delusion they are, or do you make the decision to play along with the delusion and just agree with what they're currently saying to try to de-escalate some of their anxiety, de-escalate any of their frustration or aggression that they might have, and play along with it long enough to make sure that they're not going to actively harm themselves. It just means that not just because the outcome is a shooting, it does not mean that everybody took the exact same road to get there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And when you're addressing every individual shooter, you're addressing individual people with really complex, and again, for me, fascinating disorder processes that result in these really rich distinctions in the way they behave and the paths they took to get to that unfortunate choice to actively take the lives of multiple people. So if you're in that situation and we're thinking of ways to try to help these folks, it means we've got to make sure that whatever plan we come up with or strategy, it has to take into account nuance. It has to take into account individual differences. It has to take into account the fact that these disorder processes, I mean, there's no, I mean, even if we treat schizophrenics with antipsychotics, that doesn't mean that it's going to magically fix the disorder. It just manages the symptoms. Like there is no cure for schizophrenia. It just doesn't work that way, right? But I also, again, I want to make sure I'm being very, very loud and clear about this again, as the person in the room who's in the field, and as the expert here, I have to reiterate that when you look at the Venn diagram of people who are mentally ill, the number of people who actually commit violent acts is incredibly small. You're talking like single digits. Like,
Well, and that's, I think, the biggest problem with that statement, and then what. It's just that
No, it's-
mental illness is just it's so broad.
Oh, no, it just makes me want to throw things at the person who said that.
Yeah.
No, it is not a, and I spend, because I teach intro to psychology, and we talk about mental illness, I teach lifespan psychology, talk about mental illness, I teach abnormal psychology, it's all about mental illness and mental health. And a lot of the work that I do, especially with my intro psych students, is explaining to them different doesn't mean less. Let me say that again, different does not mean less. And just because you have a mental illness doesn't mean that you can't be a functional person. And we're not dangerous. Again, I am a person who struggles with my mental health. I don't know if you really like listen to my sermons when I have the opportunity to talk. There's a reason I talk about the things that I do. It's because I struggle with anxiety and depression, and I struggle with attention deficit disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder. Mental illness usually has a whole complement of things that it sort of follows along with, and those things all interact with each other on a regular basis. But it doesn't mean that I'm less of a person. I can still accomplish really valuable things. It doesn't mean that I'm dangerous because I struggle with those issues. It just means what I deal with is just a little bit harder than other folks have to deal with. Does that make sense? It's like things that are easy for other people are a lot harder for me to do. That's why I don't shake hands with anybody. Like, I don't know if you noticed this. Like, passing a piece is such a stressful experience for me. I hate it. Because everybody's like, hi, and I'm like, no. So I usually go for a fist bump on that, so people get it first if I do, but that's just one of the ways I try to manage it, so, let me bring this back again, just gonna focus here.
You need a little pin that says your name and I do not shake.
And that's the.
I hope it worked for you then.
Oh my gosh, like everybody was like, man, this is terrible. And I'm like, I am so excited because I'm already washing my hands, I have hand sanitizer, I love these masks, so it was
Oh,
great.
it worked for my
It
husband.
worked out
It was
great.
like, it was his good excuse to.
To not
stay home and
have to do
isolate.
that, yeah, to stay home, to isolate, to take time to yourself. And that's one of the things coming out of the pandemic, what we've been having a very large conversation about in my field. There were a lot of good things that came from staying at home and learning to take care of ourselves better, that our culture does not give us. And I have been trying to carry those lessons with me forward into returning to work, where I'm actually building more time to make sure I'm home with my dogs. Because that's a therapeutic experience for me, and it's really great for them, they love it. Or that I'm, like, if someone wants to pick an argument with me, that I'm taking more time to actually say, no, I don't care. I'm extracting myself from that situation. I don't need to have a fight with you because it's really just not worth the time or the energy. Does that make sense? And that's self-care. It's setting a boundary. And it's something that helps de-escalate some of this stuff that we're talking about here, where we can, instead of just letting the balloon fill the point that it pops, allowing some gas out of it. So it's not strained and stressed all the time. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay.
Speaking of de-escalation, let's take a look at Molly's story. You remember that from page 63 and following.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question just before you move on? So are we kind of saying that mass shooters are psychotic
Oh, no.
in general and
No.
psychopaths are not, or vice versa?
No.
Psychopaths, but okay, so we're going to get very technical here. We're using the DSM diagnostic system. When you're making the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, you actually have to tell it apart from other disorders. So we would separate those as different categories completely.
But they all could be mass shooters.
There's a possibility.
Yeah, I think the point being of, as we're talking about, there's a lot of nuance in here, a lot of terms that get thrown out that are used inaccurately and so on. A lot of people who have psychotic episodes never do any kind of violence or,
Correct.
And people who are psychopathic from that profile tend not to be mass shooters anyway. If I remember from the, from the reading. So
Okay.
there's some distinction pieces, yeah.
I'm just getting clear. Go ahead.
So, yeah, Molly, the school counselor, and met a boy that was brought to her attention just the day before. He comes back before school and is dressed with a jacket, remember, that's pulled all the way up, and he's acting strangely. He goes and visits with her, and they have this this encounter. He has clearly come to do harm at the school. He's got a gun, he's got a additional ammunition, and so on. What happened in that story? What did she do?
Sit down with him on his level, talks to him, holds his hand, prays with. Did she want to praise with him?
Yeah,
Yeah. I think it's a great story that leads to the fuller technique.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There, it's just an example of them. And, maybe a bit of luck, the right person at the right place, the right person in the right place, the other person, got shot. And they're the ones who we don't hear about much, the people who put their life in risk and to save other people and are killed.
In simpler terms, what Sandy said, it was letting a little air out of the balloon
Yeah.
that was about to.
Exactly, because that, it doesn't say then, of course it was said, it isn't like this is the end of the story and everybody went on and everything was hunky-dory with the boy.
This was kind of an interesting comment she makes. I'm curious how this plays out. She says, I needed to relinquish power to lower the emotion. I needed to relinquish power. In other words, she couldn't be, I guess, the authority figure telling him what to do, that be a person, maybe, is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, if you're trying to de-escalate, I mean, you know, you could. If you're thinking about, the goal in that sort of situation is to disarm. That's different than de-escalate, I think, right? If you're trained, you know, if she had law enforcement training, she might be trained to be able to disarm. And, you know, you could do that physically. But what she, and, you know, I suppose in that kind of situation, maybe that would also have been an appropriate response if you have that kind of training. But she uses something that's much more within our wheelhouse, if you will, as because she, you know, she prays, she believes in God. She has that question, you know, asks that question, do you believe in God? And or he asked the question, do you believe in God, and so on. That sparked that. And so yeah, she, you know, if we kind of combine this question, this reflection with those 4 steps of crisis intervention, you know, rather than try to impose something in this situation, she tries to diffuse that. She goes down to his level. She gets herself centered, right? She prays in that, you know, in that moment as well. So she's fully present to him, you know, in that circumstance, and honors his pain, right? And you know, what he's going through. I think these are all really, you know, helpful to think about, you know, when, you know, we have those opportunities become present for us in the church. You know, when we have people that come, and they're not always homeless too, right? There are also people in our church that are having some sort of, you know, delusional, you know, episodes and so on. We have these opportunities. You know, and that's what struck me in that story, you know, about this book, not only about mass shootings, but things that we can do, you know, to recognize kind of the needs that are around us. And I think one thing I would like to throw into that is to recognize when, you know, maybe it's not for you. You know,
Right.
because
That's a very important thing.
Yeah. So rather than try to force something yourself, maybe you need to pull back and see if there's somebody else that can.
So, I have a rule that I follow, that I've seen other psychologists use when we are dealing with something, and it's when in doubt, refer out. And it rhymes, so it's easy to remember, but it also, if I encounter something that I would consider to be above my pay grade, I'm going to contact one of my colleagues who I know is effectively dealing with it and refer them out. Or because again, I'm an experimental psychologist, so I don't do patients, I focus on designing scientific studies. So I recognize and understand the scientific background of each of these disorders, but when it comes to actually how to like handle a psychotic episode, I have no idea what to do. So, but I know a lot of colleagues who do understand that, and I can reach out to them for help. So I think it's good for us to be aware of healthcare resources we could refer people to. And a lot of times the work that I do at college, and I deal with students who are struggling and in crisis all the time, I make sure that I am the bridge between their experience and somebody who can help them. So I advocate a lot for my students to get connected with counseling resources directly with our on-campus counselor. And that is enough. Like that is, I feel like, sufficient work for me to do. So you don't have to be the hero in any of these circumstances. If you feel like you're in over your head, that's okay. You have a lot of resources that are available that you can reach out to, including a nationwide suicide hotline that is brand new. So brand new, I don't even remember what it is.
Yeah.
It's like, it may be 811. But those are completely acceptable things to refer people to. If you feel like you're talking with someone and you're like, oh my gosh, I have no idea how to help them. But I also like to point out that just kind of talking with them and just taking the time to interact and just listen to them sometimes, maybe that just that by itself is therapeutic.
And the big thing is to focus on feelings. You know, they describe something and it's like, you know, ask them how'd that make you feel? Or that sounds kind of whatever that, you know, like that sounds kind of terrifying or,
Right.
that sort of thing. Acknowledging the feeling without trying to talk them out of a delusion.
Correct. Part of the method we use is sort of a reflective dialogue, so reflect back to them what you were hearing. That's a form of active listening. You don't need to insert your opinion, just tell them what they just told you.
Yeah.
What you just heard.
I want to share this video. This is Aaron Stark is referred to at the end of the book, and I think we have just enough time to watch and maybe talk a little bit about it. So let me see here. I think I need to go here first. Go back to Zoom. And oops. Yeah, so share screen. This may not work really well for you at home. We'll see how this goes. Sorry, because it says optimized for video clip, and I think that's not. Then it won't let me select that, and I have a feeling that could be bad. So we'll try it. If it doesn't work, we'll go to plan B.
I was almost a school shooter. In 1996, Denver, Colorado, as a student in North High, in a moment of pain and anger, I almost committed a terrible atrocity. Growing up, I learned early on there was a strange comfort and calmness in darkness. I was always the new kid. My family was very violent and aggressive, drug-addicted parents. We were moving from place to place a lot, went to 30 or 40 different schools, always seemed to be going to a new school every other week. You woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning by some cops who run across the country to get away from them and then end up at a school I'd only be at for a couple weeks and then have to do it all again a couple days later. Was the perpetual new kid. And since I also had such an unstable household, wasn't helped by the fact that I smelled really bad because I never had a shower or didn't really have any clean clothes, so I never really had any, all my clothes were dirty and torn. I had a weight problem. I was smart. I liked comic books at a time when kids didn't really like people who liked comic books that much. So every time I went to a new school, it was a whole new set of bullies. They'd do things like walk up to me and shoot me with a harpoon like I was a whale, or dunk food on my head because I said I was too fat. But the bullying wasn't just at home, or wasn't just at school. It happened at home a lot too. I was told I was worthless by just about everybody in my life. And when you're told you're worthless enough, you will believe it. Then you're going to do everything you can to make everybody else agree with it too. And so I did. I wrapped that darkness around me like a blanket and used it as a shield. It would keep the few that would agree with me close, but it kept everybody else away. I always had heard in life that there was good people and bad people. I must be one of the bad people, so I guess I would have to just do what I was supposed to do. So I got really aggressive. 12, 13 years old, I got really into heavy metal music, and I was the mosh pit when I went to concerts. The abuse just never seemed to stop. I got into cutting around 14 or 15 because I figured that there was all this extreme emotion going on in my life I had absolutely no control over. Had to find some way to find control over something, so I took to cutting myself. I still have the scars to this day. 15, 16 years old, I ended up homeless. My parents had long ago kicked me out because I didn't want to deal with their drunken fighting anymore, so I was living on the streets. I had thought I had pushed all my other friends away too, shoved them all away by lying to them or stealing from them or doing everything that my family taught me how to react to everybody, which was the complete wrong way of how to react. But I had no idea. I was just going on what I was taught. Finally, 16 years old, I'm sitting in my best friend's shed, who I thought I had already pushed away too by stealing from him and lying from him, laying in this shed with the roof wide open, rain pouring down on me into a Dungy Grace chair that was covered in cobwebs and dirt, hadn't been touched in months. And I'm sitting there with my arm covered in blood, knowing that if I didn't do something, I was going to kill myself soon. So I did the only thing I could think to do. Grabbed a phone book and I called social services. So when I went to social services, sadly, they didn't just bring me in there. They also took my mom in there too, who happened to be one of the largest sources of my pain growing up. And since she had spent her entire life running from place to place and dealing with social workers and police officers, she knew exactly what to say to get me to get them to believe that I was just making it all up. It was all just an act. I was just doing it for attention. Then they sent me home with her. And as they sent me home with her, she turned to me and she said, "Next time you should do a better job and I'll buy you the razor blades." My heart just got ripped out of me at that point completely. That darkness that I've been staring at for so long, I just ran headlong into it. I had nothing left to live for. I literally had nothing to lose. And when you have nothing to lose, you can do anything. And that is a terrifying thought. I decided that my act of doing something was I was going to express my extreme anger and rage by getting a gun. I was going to attack either my school or a mall food court. Really didn't matter to me which one. It wasn't about the people. It was about the largest amount of damage in the shortest amount of time with the least amount of security. Both those places were ripe targets. So I wish I had a better story about actually getting a gun, but that was actually really rather businesslike. There was some gangbanger kids near my school. It was back in the mid-90s when gangs were still a rather major problem in North Denver schools. And this kid had seen me, he knew me from my family, and he'd sold drugs to them before, and he knew that I wasn't really in school, I was just always at school, so he knew I wasn't a narc or anything like that. But didn't know him anything more than a first name, but that didn't really take anything more than that. I knew that they had access to guns, they talked about it all the time. So I went up to him and said, hey, can you get me a gun? Sure, get me an ounce. All right, give me 3 days. That was it. I was waiting to get myself a gun so I could kill a lot of people. But thankfully I wasn't alone in that darkness. That best friend who had saved me, I was sleeping in his shed, he saw this place that I was in. Even though I had stolen from him and lied to him and took in his belongings and ruined it all, he didn't care. He still brought me in and showed me acts of kindness. Just simple acts. It wasn't the kind of overbearing kindness where they come to you and they say, is there anything I can do to you? Is there a program I can get you in? Is there something I can do to make you better? How can I help you? It was literally just sitting down next to me, hey, would you like a meal? Let's watch a movie. Treat it like it was a Tuesday. Treat me like I was a person. And when someone treats you like you're a person, when you don't even feel like you're human, it'll change your entire world. And it did to me. He stopped me with his acts of kindness from committing that atrocity that day. If you see someone who's in that spot that needs that love, give it to them. Love the ones you feel deserve it the least because they need it the most. It'll help you just like as much as it helps them. We're in a really big dangerous spot right now with this trend of arming the teachers and looking out for the kids who might be the threat in schools and maybe turning them into the FBI. What's that going to do to a kid who's in the position that I was in 25 years ago, who's alone and depressed and abused and is just sitting there hurting and someone thinks that they're a threat? So he gets turned into the FBI, and 1 month of pain turns into a lifetime of legal trouble because one person thought he was going to be a problem. Instead of looking at that kid like he's a threat, look at him like he might be a friend. Look at him like you might be able to bring him into your fold. Show him that it's just a Tuesday. Show him that he's worth it. Show him that he can exist in this pain, even though it's intense, that at the end of it, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I found my light. Now I'm a happy family man. I have a father of 4. My wife and my daughter are in the audience today. And even bigger than that, the friend who saved my life, he's in the audience today too. Because friendship doesn't ever really die. We have to give love to the people who we think deserve it the least. Thank you.
Well, I think that clock is just a skosh slow. I don't think we have time. We'll let Aaron get the last, close to the last word and closing prayer. Lord, I pray that you would open our hearts to receive your spirit as it speaks to us through these conversations. That we can reach out to those in greatest need, to be aware of circumstances around us and know that just a little bit of love and compassion at the right time make all the difference in somebody's day and in their life and in the lives of others. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Next, please, we over to.
Yeah, next week, let's take a look at chapter 5 and spend some time on that. And then the last few chapters will kind of do some combination.